My name is Lisa Fultz, and I'm the Associate Professor of Soil Microbiology of Cropping Systems at the LSU AgCenter. And in this presentation, I want to get into a little more detail about how do I decide which cover crops to use and how do I manage those cover crops. And we're not going to get into a lot of detail about specific cover crops and their management, but this should hopefully give you some background information and the basics of what questions do I need to be asking and what concerns do I possibly need to address when thinking about what cover crops do I want to use. One of the first questions that I typically ask when meeting with producers who are interested in cover crops is also probably one of the harder questions to find an answer to, and that is, why do you want to plant cover crops? What are your goals? What are some of the problems that you have? Or what are your areas of concerns? And a lot of times these are a little harder to pinpoint, and they're often related to those secondary benefits that we previously discussed. Things like weed suppression. Are you looking for something that might help with a Italian ryegrass problem you have in your field? Are you interested in nutrient retention and nutrient cycling, and in potentially decreasing the amount of applications of fertilizer you need to do? Are you interested in increasing soil organic matter and improving soil stability and sustainability? And all of these things are potentially addressable with cover crops, but we need to know a little bit more information about what the producer wants. The next questions that come are typically a little easier because they're more specific to the producer's practices. And a lot of our cover crop selection is going to be based on some very basic properties like soil type. Certain cover crops don't have any preference on what type of soil that they'll grow well in, and some, like crimson clover, typically don't do well in more clay soil types. So we need to know a little bit of information so we can select the best variety and the best type of cover crop for a system. What kind of cash crops are you growing? Do you need some that actually help bring in nutrients to the system, like a legume that might fix nitrogen for corn or cotton? Or are you growing soybean, which doesn't necessarily need the nitrogen but might benefit from other nutrients? This will also influence things like our growing window and what season are we growing. Primarily, farmers that I work with in the Northeast region are interested in those cover crops that grow in the winter. However, in certain areas, we also see producers that need summer cover crops, and so we need to be able to address that issue. Growing window is going to be influenced greatly by what types of cash crop you grow. If you're working in a system, maybe a corn soybean or a corn cotton rotation, that growing window is going to be fairly narrow at certain times or certain parts of that rotation. Whereas if you're doing continuous soybean or maybe a cotton soybean system, that's going to influence also when you plant and how much growing time you'll have over the winter. And also what available equipment. There are certain types of planting that aren't necessarily better, but do tend to improve seed to soil contact, but not everyone has access to that kind of equipment. So these are all things that we want to know when we're looking at making recommendations for a different type of cover crop. And they're also very important for selecting different types of varieties and the type of cover crop that we're selecting for that system. Some other things that we like to take into account. One thing is you want to plant very early as you can for the cover crop, again, because we want to get the most out of the biomass production for that system. So what kind of practices do you do at the end of your cash crop growing season? What are some potential issues with pests or diseases? In this case, we were trying to avoid any cover crop that might act as a host for your cash crop for the subsequent year. One example of this, research has shown that crimson clover, which is a fairly successful nitrogen-fixing cover crop, does seem to attract or be a great benefit to red-banded stink bugs. So obviously we're not going to recommend crimson clover to a producer who may be going into soybeans the next year. What kind of termination we'll be doing, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on what that means, but are you going to be doing physical versus chemical termination, and when do you plan to do your termination? And also, how are you going to manage your residue, both of the cover crop and the cash crop? So it seems like there are a lot of questions, but most of these are ones that are easily addressed just by looking at producers' practices that they've utilized from year to year to year. One of the next ones we're going to look at is, are you interested in planting in a monoculture, so using one cover crop, or possibly looking at polycultures, which is anything from a mix of two mixes of multiple different types of cover crops. In a monoculture, there can be some benefits. Typically, we see our lower seed cost in our monoculture cover crops. And in some cases, there's some research that shows that monocultures might improve biomass production and some of the very specific benefits from those covers. However, when you think about a monoculture, I also want you to keep in mind that this is kind of an all your eggs in one basket scenario. We've had some years where certain cover crops just didn't do well, so you want to keep that in mind when you're selecting your cover crops. You can also go with a polyculture, and again, this is not, a huge mix. This could be as simple as 2 different varieties or species that you've selected, but it can be more diverse from that. Some of the benefits of polycultures, we do see an increase in diversity of that biomass that's going into your system and the benefits that may come from that. In this case, we may be seeing large amounts of organic matter inputs and the variety of root systems that you get from planting legumes and grasses together, as well as brassicas. And this is less reliant on abiotic factors for success. And what I mean by that is we are kind of avoiding that all your eggs in one basket scenario where maybe it's not a great year for a certain cover crop, but others will do well and sort of fill in that mixture. One example I can give you of this, we do research at both Dean Lee Research Station and the Macon Ridge Research Station. And last year, we had very poor stands of both wheat and cereal rye at Dean Lee, which is in central Louisiana. However, our oats, our trials that had oats in it did very, very well. We had very beneficial stands in oat. When we go to Macon Ridge, which had some of the similar mixtures and similar cover crops planted, we didn't see that. So depending on your location may influence that as well. One thing to also keep in mind with the polyculture, though, is that there may be some increased seed cost based on seed selection, as well as looking at your termination practices. Now, I'm not a proponent of either monoculture or polyculture. I think that we want to design a cover crop mixture that is beneficial to the system and meets the needs of the producer, regardless of which way you go. Seeding rates is something else that needs to be considered. There are recommendations for different seeding rates from a variety of sources. Again, my recommendation is to start with your local extension agents, NRCS agencies and agents, as well as consultants. They're going to know the most up-to-date information on what's available. I say this, for example, last year cereal rye recommendations were actually reduced for the state of Louisiana to about 45 to 50 pounds per acre. And that is based on research that's been done over the last couple of years in the state. And as those changes are made, those local individuals are going to be the ones who are more familiar with that information. Things to consider when you're deciding on what seeding rate you want to put out is you do want to plant at using the pure live seed information that's on your seed label to ensure that you're getting adequate germination of the seed that you plant. Also, you want to consider whether or not you have seed coatings on your seed. Now, typically we don't see these much in grasses, but some of our legumes and brassicas may come with an additional seed coating, which will reduce the amount of seed that's in that 50-pound bag that you buy. So you may need to adjust how much you're purchasing to get the adequate seeding rates and amounts that you need. Another thing to consider is, are you drilling or broadcasting your seed? Drill seeding does provide better seed to soil contact, so you typically will see better germination, and we've seen this in several studies, but not everybody has access to a no-till drill or a drill for their seeding. And I've known and worked with several producers who were able to get access to or purchase a relatively inexpensive unit that allows them to broadcast their seed, which does work just as well. I also know individuals who have on occasion flown their seed in when needed, because we all know Louisiana and the southern region gets some very wet periods at very unfavorable times of the year when it comes to agricultural production. So you want to use what you have access to. But because we don't see that as much seed to soil contact when broadcast seeding, you may need to increase the rate that you do. Some will say 10 to 15% for those broadcast rates. The next one is termination, and this is again, how are you going to terminate that cover crop? You can use physical termination using a roller or crimper. These can be very beneficial because they're not an additional cost each year for purchasing the chemicals, but they're not always readily available. Not many people have a roller crimper just laying around that they can utilize, and timing is very important. You want to get to those cover crops at the point where breaking that stem and the movement of nutrients throughout that plant is at its optimum. So you do have to time it right, but that's true for all termination methods, really. And I've talked to several individuals who have built their own roller crimpers for relatively cheap. So it is possible and an option, although it's not one that's used as commonly in the South region. Chemical termination is probably the one most people are more familiar with. Some of the things to consider here are what are some potential residual impacts, both from your previous practice for cash crops. Remember, we want to get our cover crops in the ground as quickly as possible, and if there's something that you were applying to your cash crop, you want to make sure that that's not going to influence the germination of your cover crops. And the same thing, the chemicals that you're using, if you're using chemical termination for your cover crops, you don't want that influencing the cash crop that you're planting. So you want to keep those in mind when you're planning your termination methods and your termination timing. One of the benefits of chemical termination is that many producers may already have an existing spray that they do in the spring for weeds, and this may fit in with that timing, so you're not necessarily having to add a trip through your field. Again, timing is still important. We've seen this for the last few years, particularly going into early termination scenarios where people are trying to terminate in February, potentially even in January, going into those early cropping systems. And if the temperatures are cold enough that the plants aren't really growing, they're also not interacting and taking up those herbicides, and so you're not getting a successful termination. So you want to be very careful and aware of the weather when you're doing that application. And again, you do want to keep in mind that you may need different chemistries based on the types of cover crops that you have in your mixture or in your field. And then the last part I want to talk about is termination timing. And this is something that we're looking into a lot more closely. You have scenarios where we have early termination, and this may reduce the biomass production in the period of ground cover that you have available to you, but it does provide some potential benefit if you're concerned about things like the green bridge. It also will influence timing of nutrient release. We've been doing a lot of research looking at when do those nutrients that are part of the cover crop population become more available. And what we found is that in the case of nitrogen, at least in the northeast part of Louisiana, we typically see that nitrogen release somewhere around 5 to 6 weeks after termination, which may influence when you terminate your cover crop, as you want that nutrient to be available to your cash crop. And again, going back to termination methods, chemical effectiveness may be reduced if you're doing this very early in the year when temperatures are not conducive. And late termination or planting green is something that is definitely growing in interest and popularity, and we're doing more and more research into this. And what this does is allow you to maximize the growth and ground cover of the cover crops. And you're seeing the sort of most benefit from that. Now, some research, particularly in sugarcane, has shown that the later and later that you terminate those cover crops, you may start to see some influences on yield. But again, a lot of that information will be coming available very, very soon. And this may be something that if you are very concerned about the green bridge and the fact that these cover crops may be harboring insects, that you want to take into account and be watching for if you're considering doing late or planting green. Again, I want to thank you and invite you, if you have any questions or anything that you're interested in, please feel free to contact me via email or through my office number. And thank you very much for your time.